that's true. Naked Palpatine.
Oh, you pick that one. Fresh out of the clone tank, nude Palpatine is my
Well, that's the first thing I think of when you say Dark Empire Palpatine.
Hello everybody, and let us walk with rhythm. So this is a very recent reread of Dune for me, because I read it last year, but Dune Part 2 is coming out, the film, in March, so I want to make sure I had the whole book fresh in my mind, so that way, I could rewatch Part 1 on, the multiple streaming platforms there are, and then I could go straight into 2 once it comes out. Many people review Dune. It's not like certain expanded universe books in Star Wars where they haven't been read too much, depending on what I'm reviewing. But Dune has been reviewed quite a bit by different booktubers and the like, So, I don't know if I can say anything really new here. Dune is an interesting phenomenon as it is quite a big influence, not even just on Star Wars, but if you're a Star Wars fan, I think for the sake of, if you want to know what made Star Wars, then you read Dune and you read multiple things that Joe Bongiorno would tell you to read. That helped influence Star Wars. But this isn't about Star Wars. I'm just saying that's one of the big things that even got me to read it, was I learned that Star Wars was heavily influenced by it. And I saw the trailer for Part 1 by Denis Villeneuve, and I thought it looked great. And so I picked up the book and I read it. It is an interesting world that Dune is set in because it's in the future, but it's not a typical sci-fi story. There's no robots, there's no heavy machinery. It is very fantasy-esque, but it's not. You got people with superpowers, basically. Mentats, human computers, the Bene Gesserit, witches, navigators, these beings that aren't exactly human anymore, that explore the stars, But at the same time, you have this very fantasy sort of thing of, here's an emperor, here's these, houses, kind of like Game of Thrones. In fact, I've also heard this book titled as The Game of Thrones, but in space, and there's a bit to it with that. But the big theme of Dune is kind of the antithesis to if you're a religious person, but it's not to believe in any saviors or any one person to save you. Now, this first book, I don't feel like really delves into that too much, because while there are sequels where Paul may not be the hero we exactly thought he was going to be, there's only a couple little nods here and there that may be the case, because everything ends rather peachy-dory, outside of people having to die in order for Paul to win. But Dune is a story of a boy who grows into what he needs to become, but at the same time, what he grows into may not be what for the best. It's a very cautionary tale, but it is, if you are a political, not like real life politics, but if you're like somebody who's engrossed in world building and political stuff, then I think you'll find something here to really enjoy. This story is not very fast paced. There's a lot of ideas here, and that's kind of a trend with the Dune books. There's a lot of cool ideas and concepts and philosophy, but in terms of actual plot progression or fluidity through the pages, like fast pace or just feeling like it's an easy to just flip, it's not really like that, because it kind of wants you to take time to invest and think about. Which that's for some people and it's not for others. This one's probably the most palatable of the original Frank Hebert works to sit down and do that for. As you continue going, it's going to get a little bit more cerebral, a little bit more philosophical, and it'll become a little bit less easier to just read it at face value. Of course, there's also the prequels and sequels by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, which are a lot easier to read, but are still just as heavily political at the very least, with machinations from every opposing side. But we have these ancient feuds between these two big houses, because there's the emperor and then there's all these houses beneath that are like royalty. And there's two that we know of in this book that gets talked about. In the prequels, we actually get a lot more. We get to delve into a lot of other minor houses and stuff like that. Very, like I said, very Game of Thrones-ish. Or I guess Game of Thrones is very like Dune. But we have House Atreides and House Harkonnen. And they're cousins. But they have this long-standing feud. We don't really know what that's about. If you want to know what that's about, you have to kind of read the Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson prequel books. But they've had this feud for a long time, and the Harkonnens don't like the Atreides, and Atreides get the rights to Arrakis. Now, of course, if you've seen the first part of the film, then you already know kind of half of what I'm talking about here. If you've seen the film and haven't read the book, and you're interested in reading the book, you only got half of the story. But, they get the rights to Arrakis, so Paul and his family move in to Arrakis, and then an assassination attempt happens, and Paul is left alone with his mother, and they find the Fremen, who are these religious desert people, and the way, it's clear that Frank Herbert took a lot of effort and care to make that be respectful, and in some senses, a lot of times, the Fremen are more correct than the sophisticated, royalty system that got going on with the houses and everything. And Paul learns from them, grows from them, into the being he was prophesized to be. But he's not really a Messiah, and that's part of the thing, though. But it's a very interesting world in that first half. The second half, when you see the movie, if you see part 2 in March, it's going to be Paul training. It's going to be Paul, integrating himself with those people. And then he's going to take up a campaign against the Empire. And he will, only slight spoilers, he's going to end up becoming the Emperor himself. And that's kind of going to be the climax of the story, because you really only got the first quarter of the novel. So there's a lot of other weird stuff that gets into the second half with Paul's sister that is like a newborn but has the mind of like an adult. It's a lot of weird and crazy stuff like that. And if you think that's weird, the series gets even weirder as you go on. But there's a lot of great, interesting dynamics and elements here, from the Bene Gesserit themselves, to the Mentats, to House Harkonnen, House Atreides, to the space navigators, the Sardaukar, everything there. There's so many interesting moving parts to all of that. And it's really a story worth reading at least once. I know you'll have the films to kind of watch if you aren't much of a book reader, but it is something worth checking out, as it's a big piece of sci-fi history that I think is worth a view. But that's pretty much it. I can't really say anything that other people haven't already said about this book. This book has been talked about quite a bit on the internet, so I don't want to, waste time repeating stuff that other people have said. But it is not a perfect book. Nothing is perfect, and anybody who tells you it's a masterpiece, they're right. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect for everyone. Everybody has their different tastes. One thing that I think Frank Herbert isn't very good at is characterization, in the sense that he'll give you, like, everybody here is a character and they have enough character for me to like them. But Frank Herbert is not a character-first person. He is a plot and ideas first, character second. And for me, that's an issue because I'm a character-first person. I can deal with a bad plot if the characters are written in such a way that I care about them regardless. So with silly books like The Crystal Star in Star Wars, I can like it still because I care about the characters. But that's also I can't use that as much because it's attached to a franchise. So, but basically, if you can have a story where I love the characters but the plot is stupid, I'll still like your story. But if I mean, I want a good plot too, but if I have to choose one over the other. Yeah, so that'd be my biggest complaint is pacing sometimes and characterization. He makes adequate characters that I can care about and root for, but doesn't dive into them enough for me to really feel for them. At least not in this first book. So that's pretty much my thoughts. I'm gonna get into some spoilers. If you don't want that because you want to be surprised for part 2 or you just want to read this for yourself, leave. The Gom Jabbar test is a famous scene. It's one of the first scenes in the movie, and it's a great scene in the book as well, and I love everything about it. I love Stilgar. Actually, one thing I should mention is that Feyd-Rautha is going to be a big part of Dune Part 2. He gets introduced fairly early on in the novel, but he's not at all shown in the movie. Part 1 anyway. But he is one of the other nephews to the Baron Harkonnen. We have Raban, who we get to see a lot in the first movie, and then we have Feyd-Rautha, who will be a big part of the sequel. But yeah. Also, side note, just for you, those who don't know, if you want to hate the Baron more than you might already, if you haven't read the book, the Baron's a pedo, and they don't really address this at all in the movie. But yeah, he likes to touch little boys, specifically his nephew, Feyd-Rautha. And I just wanted you to hate him more than you might already. So in case you didn't know that. The Baron is a creepy villain because sometimes we have to see things or read a chapter from his POV. We have to hear him talk about his nephew's legs, and it's just uncomfy. It is an uncomfy feeling. Stilgar, I love Stilgar. They put the scene in the movie, but when he spits on the table and everything about that, just from the culture of the Fremen to Stilgar's delivery, I guess, is just phenomenal. And casting Javier Bardem was just magic in a bottle. That, to me, was perfect casting. The one scene that didn't make it into the movie that I really love is the dinner scene, where they're on Arrakis now, and they're holding a dinner, and they got all these royalty people, or just people around, and they're all talking. But there's deeper stuff behind all that. Leah Kynes is there. Leah Kynes is also a guy in the book, by the way. He's not a chick like he is in the movie. But they're all talking, but we also get to see inside their thoughts. So there's a lot of tension in that dinner scene. But it was just yeeted from the movies. Has been disappointed in that. And of course, Yue betrays the Atreides. His wife was kidnapped and killed. They slightly address this in the movie, but they kind of harp on it more in the book. That Yue feels really guilty about what he has to do, but that he does it anyway. And he's probably one of the strongest characters in terms of me feeling for them in this whole novel. They don't really use him as well as I would have liked in the movie, but again, part of the problem is that Dune really heavily relies on you knowing what the characters are thinking, and if you can't know what they're thinking, it's a bit harder to portray that in live action, where you can't go inside their thoughts. The David Lynch film tried to compensate from that by using a lot of monologuing and exposition, and that just didn't work because you don't do that in films. So, I still don't think that the new Dune movie was a perfect rendition of the novel, but in terms of translating story to film, it's probably the best we'd ever get of that. Then we jump ahead. It's interesting seeing the Baron talk to Fenring in this book because, again, Fenring's just kind of there. We know that he's best buds with Shadon, but outside of that, we don't know much about Fenring other than he likes to say a lot, But again, this is another reason why I appreciate the prequels by Frank Herbert's son and Kevin Janderson, because it made a character that was really a nothing character in Dune and made him somebody that, I know this guy, I know what he's all about. I like this guy. Not necessarily I like him in terms of what he does, but he's a fun character. Then we get to more of the ending. we find out that Paul's son died, which I forgot. So I guess Leto the Second in Children of Dune is Leto the Second 0.5, I guess. We have this whole thing too, which I haven't even addressed, which is Jessica conceives a daughter named Alia, and she, again, like, is like a toddler, but she has the mind of an adult, and it's really bizarre and weird, and she kills the Baron really abruptly. Actually, I think it's said more in hindsight. It's just really bizarre, and I'm sure we'll get more with her in Dune Messiah, but it's just weird. It's just weird. Fade versus Paul. This is a big thing we'll get to see in Dune Part 2, which is that, Fade and Paul fight to the death, and Paul wins. Paul also becomes Emperor of the known universe by marrying Irulan. One other thing I love, too, is that he marries the daughter of the Emperor, but it says, "You will only be my wife in name, and name only. My love, my other half, will always be Chani. She's going to be my true partner. But for political reasons, Irulan will be my wife." Other interesting thing about that is most of the little, history lessons or little history quotes at the beginning of each chapter is written by Irulan because she's a historian. But again, we don't get much with her. So I was actually really happy when Frank Herbert's son and Kevin J. Anderson wrote Princess of Dune, because I get to know a little bit more about Irulan, because she's really a nothing character in Dune. So, but perhaps we'll see more of her in Dune Messiah. I guess we'll see when we get there. But yeah, overall, it is not a perfect book. I don't even know if would be my top 10 necessarily. It might be. I just have to read some more books to find out if that's true or not. But it's certainly a masterpiece. I think it'd be hard to press to not admit that. It is a very classic and important and relevant and influential piece of sci-fi that if you're into sci-fi or just like books in general, then Dune is a book. Even if you don't like it, you need to at least read once to see for yourself. But yeah, overall, moving forward, I'm moving into an era that I have no knowledge of. I have not read past the original Dune novel. So as we move forward, everything's going to be brand new to me. So I look forward to experiencing what Frank Herbert and his son has to offer as we move forward into this uncharted territory. Till next time. Hopefully the worms don't catch you. Bye-bye.